What do you do when the most dangerous man in the city looks you dead in the eye and insults your body in a language he's certain you don't understand? Most people would freeze. Most people would smile politely and walk away. But she wasn't most people. And the moment those cruel words left his mouth, in a tongue he used like a secret weapon, she made a choice that would flip her entire life upside down. Stay with me, because this story takes turns you will not see coming. The lighting inside the restaurant was the kind designed to flatter people who already had everything. Soft, golden light spilled across polished, dark wood tables, bounced off crystal hanging from the ceiling, and made even the most ordinary faces look like they belonged on magazine covers. This place sat right in the middle of Manhattan, a quiet little kingdom for the rich and the powerful. People came here to be seen, to close deals worth more than most folks make in a lifetime, to whisper secrets over glasses of wine that cost more than a month's rent. For Josephine Miller, though, none of that glamour meant a thing. To her, this restaurant was just a place to work, a place where the tips were good enough to keep a roof over her head. She had a nickname she liked to keep to herself. She called it the battlefield, because every single night she walked in ready to fight for those tips with a smile glued to her face. Now, Josie didn't look like the other women working the floor. The manager who ran the place, a tightly wound man named Albert Henderson, had a very specific idea of what a server should look like. The uniform told you everything. A snug black dress built for one body type and one body type only. Thin, delicate. The kind of figure that disappears when it turns sideways. Josie was none of those things. She was plus size and she carried every curve like she owned the room. Dark hair pinned up in a sharp, elegant twist. Lips painted a bold, fearless red. She didn't shrink. She didn't apologize for the space she took up. So why did Albert hire her if she broke his whole mold? Simple. She had something the skinny girls couldn't fake. Composure. Steel nerves. You could sit a billionaire down in front of her, an arrogant movie star, a politician with an ego the size of a building, and Josie wouldn't blink. She handled the worst of them with the calm of someone who had seen it all and decided none of it scared her. But that particular night, something in the air had changed. The usual warm, easy mood of the place had curdled into something heavy, something tense. You could feel it pressing down on your shoulders. At exactly 10 o'clock, the front doors swung open and the gentle hum of conversation just stopped. Like someone had hit a switch. The room went quiet and a name rippled through the staff in nervous whispers. He had arrived. This man was the kind of person people only spoke about in hushed tones, the kind of name traded in boardrooms and back alleys like a ghost story you weren't sure was true. He ran a criminal empire, a web of extortion, smuggling, and worse, all hidden behind a shiny front of legitimate real estate. On paper, he was a successful businessman. In reality, he was something far darker, and he looked the part too. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wrapped in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it practically whispered money. His face was all hard angles and cold lines, and his eyes, dark as wet stone, swept across the room with the lazy confidence of a man who believed he owned everything they landed on. 3 large men trailed behind him, the kind of men whose suits couldn't quite hide what they were built for. The staff hurried him toward the private corner in the back, a hidden table tucked behind velvet ropes and tall green ferns. Albert practically lunged for Josie as she passed the bar. His face had gone pale, sweat beading along his hairline, and his fingers clamped around her elbow. "Josie!" he hissed. "Table 9, the party in the back. Listen to me carefully. Don't make eye contact. Don't hang around. Pour the wine, take their order, and get out of their air as fast as you can." She just looked at him, calm as ever, balancing a silver tray with a bottle of wine that cost more than her car. "It's just another table, Albert." "No." His voice cracked. "It is not just another table. That man could buy this entire building tomorrow and burn it to the ground for fun. Be careful, please." Josie smoothed down the front of her apron, pulled in a slow breath, and walked toward the back corner. The second she stepped past the velvet rope, she felt it. The temperature seemed to drop. The air got colder, thinner, like the room itself knew to be afraid. He sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of scotch, not looking at anyone. To his left sat his right-hand man, a guy hunched over a cheap phone, scrolling through something with a permanent smirk on his face. "Good evening, gentlemen," Josie said, her voice smooth and warm and professional. "Can I start you off with our chef's tasting menu tonight, or would you prefer to order from the regular selection?" The boss didn't even glance up. His eyes stayed locked on the little candle flickering in the center of the table. But his second-in-command looked up, and that smirk twisted into something nastier. As Josie leaned in to fill the man's glass, her hip brushed against the edge of the oversized leather chair. It was nothing, an accident. The table was cramped, the chairs were huge, and there simply wasn't enough room to move without touching something. But that tiny bump made the wine glass clink hard against the bottle, and a single drop of deep red wine slipped over the rim and landed on the spotless white tablecloth. The right-hand man clicked his tongue, loud and dramatic, like she'd just smashed a priceless vase. And then, finally, the boss looked up. His eyes were black and empty, not a single flicker of warmth in them. He dragged his gaze over her, slow and deliberate, lingering on her hips, her waist, with a look that mixed pure disgust with simple irritation, like she was an inconvenience, an object that had failed to do its job. Then, without breaking that cold stare, he leaned slightly toward his man and spoke, but not in English, not in Italian either. He spoke in fast, rough Arabic, a language he'd picked up over years of doing very illegal business in the Middle East. It had become his favorite trick. When he wanted to say something cruel or private right out in the open, he'd switch to Arabic, certain that the people around him, the waiters, the staff, the ordinary nobodies he thought of as cattle, would never understand a word. "Look at this one," he murmured in Arabic, his voice a low, mocking rumble. "She eats more than she serves. A clumsy, fat cow blocking the whole walkway. Get her out of my sight before she breaks the furniture." His man let out a quiet, cruel laugh and lifted his hand to shoo her away like she was a fly buzzing too close. They were so sure of themselves. They fully expected her to lower her eyes, mumble an apology for that one tiny drop of spilled wine, and scurry off, completely clueless about the vicious thing that had just been said about her body. They had no idea who they were dealing with. See, here's what they didn't know. Before her father passed away, he'd spent years working as a senior civilian contractor for the Department of Defense. His job had taken him and his whole family overseas, first to Cairo, then to Beirut. Josie had spent 10 years of her childhood and her teenage years living and breathing those cultures, soaking up the languages, learning the dialects, the rhythms, the slang. She didn't just study Arabic later in college, where she earned a degree in Middle Eastern linguistics. She had lived it. She spoke it the way the people on the street spoke it, sharp, fast, native. So when those words hit her ears, every single one landed. Josie went still. The silver tray in her hands trembled for just a heartbeat before her grip turned to iron. A hot, blinding rush of anger rolled through her, drowning out every warning Albert had given her, every instinct telling her to keep her head down and her mouth shut. Slowly, deliberately, she set the wine bottle down on the table. The heavy thud of glass meeting wood made the right-hand man flinch. Josie squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and looked straight down at the most feared man in the city. The air in that little corner seemed to vanish. "A real man," she said, and she said it in Arabic. Clear, crisp, every word perfectly pronounced, cutting right through the soft jazz playing in the background. A real man does not need to borrow another language to insult a woman's body. Only a pathetic coward hides behind words he thinks his victim cannot understand. The right-hand man's jaw dropped so fast it was almost comical. The phone slipped right out of his fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. But the boss, his reaction was something else entirely. The bored, snobbish disgust melted off his face and was replaced by raw, genuine shock. His dark eyes went wide, locked onto her blazing stare like he couldn't believe what he was seeing, what he was hearing. For 10 long, agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The silence was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. The 2 armed men standing near the ferns instinctively reached inside their jackets, sensing the spike in tension. But the boss lifted a single finger, just one, and they froze instantly. "You!" he started, his voice a rough whisper, finally speaking English. "You!" "If my presence offends you, sir," Josie cut in smoothly, switching back to English, her tone now cold as ice. "I'll gladly have another server take over your table. Enjoy your evening. And she didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait to be dismissed. Josie turned on her heel and walked straight out of that corner, head held high, back perfectly straight, every step radiating dignity. Behind her, the silence of that dangerous man was louder than any gunshot could ever be. Now, for the next 2 days, Josie lived on a knife's edge. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Every time her apartment buzzer went off, she jumped half out of her skin. She checked over her shoulder walking to the subway, scanned every parked car, studied every stranger's face. Because everybody knows you don't publicly humiliate a man like that and just stroll away like nothing happened. There are consequences. There are always consequences. But Friday came and went. Then Saturday. And the streets of Manhattan stayed perfectly normal. No black cars idling outside her building. No strange men following her home. By Tuesday evening, Josie had finally let herself relax. She decided she'd gotten lucky. Maybe a man with that much power was too proud to even remember some waitress who'd talked back. Maybe he had bigger fish to fry than one loudmouthed server. She was wrong. Again. It was 10:30 at night. The restaurant was winding down, the last few diners lingering over dessert and coffee. Josie was in the back room, counting up her receipts for the night, when the kitchen door slammed open so hard it bounced off the wall. A co-worker stood there, a fellow server, and every drop of color had drained from her face. "Josie," she gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "Albert says you need to get out to the floor. Right now." "I'm off the clock in 20 minutes, Josie said, frowning. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "The restaurant is empty," the woman whispered, her voice shaking. "I mean, it's empty. These men in suits came in about 10 minutes ago. They paid everybody's checks, all of them. They told the customers to leave. And they locked the front doors." Cold dread pooled in Josie's stomach. She dropped her pen, untied her apron, and pushed past her co-worker into the main dining room. What she walked into didn't feel real. The restaurant, normally buzzing with life and chatter and clinking glasses, was completely deserted. The busboys, the bartenders, the hostesses, all gone. The only person near the bar was Albert, looking like he might pass out at any second. And there, sitting alone at a table dead in the center of the empty room, was him. No entourage this time. Well, almost none. His right-hand man stood by the front door, arms crossed, throwing the deadbolt shut. The boss himself wore a tailored black shirt, the top 2 buttons open, looking utterly relaxed in the eerie silence of a restaurant he'd emptied out just for her. When his eyes found Josie, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit, Josephine," he said. His voice was a low, commanding rumble that sent a shiver crawling up her spine. Josie planted her feet. "How do you know my name?" "I know a great deal more than your name," he replied, leaning back in his chair like he had all the time in the world. "Sit. I'm not in the habit of repeating myself. And I'm not in the habit of being held hostage at my own job," she shot back, even though her heart was slamming against her ribs. But slowly, she walked over. She pulled out the chair and sat down across from him, keeping her spine straight, refusing to let herself shrink under that intense, calculating stare. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. There was a dangerous pull to him, a kind of coiled electric energy that made the very air between them feel charged. His dark eyes traced the line of her cheek, the stubborn set of her jaw, studying her like a puzzle he intended to solve. You have courage, Josephine, he finally said. Stupid, reckless courage. Do you have any idea what usually happens to people who call me a coward in front of my own men? I'm guessing they end up at the bottom of the river, Josie answered flatly. But if you're here to kill me, doing it in a restaurant full of security cameras seems pretty sloppy for a man with your reputation. He let out a low, rough laugh that genuinely startled her. It wasn't cruel. It was real amusement. I have no intention of harming you, he said, leaning forward, the laughter fading into something sharp and businesslike. In fact, I'm here to offer you a job. Josie just stared, certain she'd misheard. A job? You cleared out a 5-star restaurant to offer a waitress a job? I don't need a waitress, he said softly. I need a translator and a negotiator. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder, tossing it onto the table. It slid to a stop just inches from her hands. My organization is expanding, he explained, his voice dropping lower. Right now, I'm in the middle of negotiating a very sensitive, very profitable arrangement with a group operating out of Alexandria. These men are proud, traditional, and deeply, dangerously paranoid. My usual translators aren't good enough. They know the words, sure, but they don't understand the meaning underneath the words. They don't grasp the respect, the nuance, the cultural rules you have to follow to actually close a deal with people like this. And you think I do? Josie asked, baffled. Your accent that night, he murmured, leaning closer. It wasn't something learned from a textbook. It was authentic. You lived there, didn't you, in the Middle East? For years. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. Perfect. I need you to come with me to a meeting this Friday. You'll translate for me. You'll read the room. You'll tell me when they're lying. And you'll make sure my words land with exactly the right amount of respect and exactly the right amount of threat underneath. You're out of your mind. Josie scoffed and pushed her chair back. I'm a civilian. I pour overpriced wine for rich snobs. I'm not getting tangled up in mob politics. Hire a professional. I can't use a professional, he countered, his eyes hardening. Anyone known in my world is a liability, a risk. I need a ghost, someone with absolutely no connection to any of this. Someone they'll never suspect of being anything more than a pretty assistant. He paused, and his eyes dragged over her again, but this time there was no disgust in them. This time there was something warmer, something unsettling. Though you're a great deal more than that, aren't you? Josie stood up. My answer is no. I'm leaving. Sit down, Josephine. The warmth was gone. It was a flat, terrifying command. Josie froze, but she didn't sit. You said you weren't going to hurt me. And I'm not, he agreed, tapping one long finger against the folder. But I can't speak for what the Irish crew is going to do to your younger brother. The blood drained from her face. She stared down at the folder, a sick feeling rising in her throat. Liam, he said, speaking her brother's name like a judge handing down a sentence. 22 years old, a crushing addiction to underground poker. Right now he owes $50,000 to a crew run by a man named Sullivan. And Sullivan is famous for his lack of patience. Your brother missed his payment yesterday. Sullivan's men are out looking for him as we speak. They're going to break his legs, and after that, they'll come looking for you, his only living relative. To collect the rest, Josie grabbed the folder and flipped it open with shaking hands. Inside were photographs of her brother walking out of some grimy basement club in Queens, copies of betting slips, a detailed ledger of every dollar he owed. Her hands trembled violently. She'd known Liam was in trouble. He'd been asking to borrow money for weeks, but she'd had no idea the hole went this deep. You bastard, she whispered, her voice cracking. Did you set him up? I don't play games with children, he replied coldly. His debts are his own doing. I simply happen to have very good informants. But here's the thing, Josephine. I can make this entire problem disappear. He stood up slowly. He was a full foot taller than her, and standing this close, he was overwhelming. He smelled of cedar, expensive tobacco, and pure power. "Help me close this deal Friday," he said, his voice dropping to a hypnotic murmur. "Be my voice. Make sure I don't get cheated. Do this one thing, and I'll wipe Liam's debt clean. I'll pay Sullivan off myself, out of my own pocket. Your brother lives, and you walk away free." Josie looked up into those dark, bottomless eyes, and in that moment, she hated him. She hated his arrogance, his power, the effortless way he'd backed her into a corner with nowhere to run. But then she thought about Liam, her foolish, desperate little brother, and she knew she had no choice at all. "If I do this," she said, her voice trembling but her chin lifted in defiance, "you never speak to me again. You never go near my brother, and you never set foot in this restaurant again." He stared down at her, and something complicated, something she couldn't read, flickered across his stony face. He reached out and gently brushed his warm, rough fingers along her jaw. She flinched, but he didn't pull away right away. "We have a deal, Josephine," he whispered. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. Josie had traded a life of pouring wine for a seat at the devil's own table. And what she didn't realize, what she couldn't possibly know yet, was that this man had absolutely no intention of ever letting her walk away. Friday night came fast. A black armored SUV sliced through the rain-soaked streets near the old Brooklyn shipyards, heavy tires hissing over the wet asphalt. Josie sat rigid in the back seat, hands folded tight in her lap. She wore a midnight blue pantsuit, perfectly tailored, delivered to her just hours earlier by his personal tailor. It was supposed to feel like armor. But underneath all that expensive fabric, she felt completely naked, exposed. Like everyone could see exactly how scared she was. He sat beside her, a silent, looming shadow in the dim interior. The quiet between them was suffocating. She glanced over at him and noticed the hard set of his jaw, and the relaxed, almost bored way he held a heavy pistol resting across his knee. To him, this was just another night, just another routine meeting. To her, it was stepping blindly off the edge of a cliff. "Are you afraid, Josephine?" he asked suddenly, his voice a low rumble over the hum of the engine. He didn't even turn his head to look at her. "I'm terrified," she admitted honestly, her voice trembling no matter how hard she tried to steady it. "Good," he replied, finally turning those dark eyes toward her. "Fear keeps you sharp. Fear keeps you alive. Just remember what we discussed. Translate exactly what their leader says, word for word, but more importantly, listen for what he doesn't say. Listen for the hesitation, the shift in his tone. Tonight, you are my radar." The SUV rolled to a heavy stop outside a sprawling abandoned shipping warehouse. The rain hammered down on the roof in a relentless drumbeat. It was time. Inside, the warehouse was vast and damp, the air thick with the smell of salt water, rust, and something older and darker underneath. A single, harsh halogen lamp hung from the high ceiling, throwing brutal shadows across the floor and lighting up a large wooden crate that served as a makeshift table in the center of the room. On the far side of that pool of light stood 5 men. Their leader was a slim, elegant man with slicked-back silver hair and eyes like shattered glass. Cold, glittering, empty. The boss stepped confidently into the light, gesturing subtly for Josie to stand just behind his right shoulder. His men fanned out around the edges of the room, securing the corners, hands never far from their weapons. The silver-haired man smiled, a thin, venomous expression that never reached his eyes, and began speaking in rapid, formal Arabic. "Welcome," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of fake hospitality. "It is a profound honor to finally conduct our business face-to-face here in your city." Josie translated seamlessly, keeping her voice flat and steady, stripped of all emotion, and the boss replied in English, laying out his terms for the shipment, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. Back and forth it went, a tense, careful dance of power, greed, and ego. For 20 grinding minutes, everything went exactly the way he'd predicted. And then, the atmosphere shifted. The silver-haired man's voice dropped. It got softer, more rhythmic, almost musical. He talked about mutual respect, about shared enemies, about the long-term profits they'd all enjoy together. But Josie, listening with the trained ear of someone who knew this language down to its bones, caught something. A tiny, subtle change. He had suddenly switched, mid-sentence, from the formal, educated dialect he'd used all night into a very specific regional slang. The kind of heavily coded street language used only by the coastal smugglers of Alexandria. He wasn't talking to the boss anymore. He was giving an order to his hidden men. Josie's blood turned to ice. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "The shipment is ready," the silver-haired man was saying smoothly, his eyes locked on the boss. "We can finalize the transfer tonight. We simply require a small gesture of good faith from your side." But that's not what he'd really said. Hidden in those coded vowels, woven into the slang, was something else entirely. Something deadly. Josie leaned in close to the boss's ear, her breath catching. "He just told his men up on the catwalk to lock the doors," she whispered, panic threading through every word. "It's an ambush. There is no shipment. They never had one. They're here to kill you and take over your eastern territory." He didn't flinch. He didn't glance up at the dark shadows lurking on the catwalk above. His face stayed completely impassive, a mask carved from stone. "Tell him," he said quietly in English, his voice a low and terrifying rumble that echoed through the cavernous space, "that I'm fresh out of good faith." Before Josie could even open her mouth to translate the warning, the whole warehouse erupted. He moved with terrifying speed. He grabbed Josie around the waist and practically threw her behind a massive steel shipping container, just as the first deadly barrage of automatic gunfire rained down from the catwalk above. The roar of it filled the entire space, deafening, endless, echoing off the metal walls. Concrete dust, shattered glass, and blinding sparks showered down all around them. Josie hit the cold floor hard, covering her ears, pressing her face against her knees, trembling as the world tore itself apart around her. He returned fire instantly, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. The polished businessman was gone. In his place stood something far older and far more dangerous, a warlord defending his life and everything he'd built. "Stay down!" he roared over the chaos. His men were scattered, returning fire, trying to pin the snipers behind the rusted steel support beams. And the silver-haired leader. He'd vanished completely into the shadows, all that elegant confidence replaced by a coward's desperate retreat into the dark. Josie pressed her back against the cold metal of the container, breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. She'd never been anywhere near a gunfight in her life. The reality of it was overwhelming. The explosive noise, the acrid smoke burning her throat, the sharp, metallic tang of blood hanging heavy in the air. A stray bullet sparked off the corner of their barricade, sending a shower of hot metal fragments raining down over her shoulder. She cried out in sudden pain, clutching her arm. Instantly, he dropped to one knee beside her, his dark eyes wide with something she hadn't seen in him before. Alarm. Real, uncontrolled alarm. "Are you hit?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulder. "No," she gasped, tears stinging her eyes. "Just sparks. I'm okay." His grip on her was iron-strong, and yet somehow impossibly protective. In the middle of all this carnage, surrounded by men trying to put a bullet in his head, he was focused on one thing and one thing only: her survival. He barked a command into a small radio clipped to his collar, ordering covering fire on the east wall. Then he turned back to her, his face inches from hers, the smell of gunpowder and cedar swirling together. "Listen to me, Josephine. When I give the signal, you run straight for the exit. Don't stop for anything. Don't look back. I'll cover you." "I can't outrun bullets," she cried, panic threatening to swallow her whole. "You won't have to," he promised, his voice an unshakable anchor in the violent storm. "I will not let them touch you. Do you trust me?" It was an absurd question. He was a criminal, a mob boss, the man who had blackmailed her into this nightmare in the first place. And yet looking into his eyes, she saw something rock solid, unwavering resolve. He was putting his own life on the line to make sure she survived a mistake that was entirely his. Josie swallowed hard. She nodded, and she got ready to run. Go! He stepped out boldly from behind cover, unleashing a relentless barrage of fire up at the catwalk, and Josie ran. She pushed her legs as hard as they would go, her dress shoes slipping on the wet concrete. The exit was a glowing rectangle of pale moonlight 50 yards away. The gunfire was deafening, but somehow, miraculously, nothing touched her. His covering fire was pinning the enemy down completely. She burst through the heavy loading doors into the freezing, rain-swept night. A moment later, he came charging out of the darkness behind her, grabbing her arm, pulling her toward a second vehicle hidden in a nearby alley. They threw themselves into the back of the armored sedan, and it tore off into the night. The safe house turned out to be a lavish penthouse perched high above the glittering Manhattan skyline. A world away from the bloody warehouse they'd just escaped. Josie sat curled on a velvet sofa, a blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, staring blankly into the flames of a crackling fireplace. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of amber whiskey in his hand. He ditched his ruined jacket, and his white shirt was streaked with dirt and soot, but he seemed utterly untouched by the violence they'd just lived through. "You saved my life tonight, Josephine," he said quietly, breaking the heavy silence. "If you hadn't caught that shift in his dialect, I'd be lying dead on that warehouse floor right now." He played a very clever game, but he underestimated the waitress. Josie looked up at him, her exhaustion warring with the anger still simmering inside her. "I did what I had to do to survive. I held up my end of the deal. Now it's time for you to hold up yours." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. He walked over to a polished desk, picked up a thick envelope, and tossed it gently onto the coffee table in front of her. "Liam's debts are paid, every cent. Sullivan will never so much as glance in his direction again. Your brother is completely free." He paused, "and as promised, so are you." Josie stared at that envelope, and a wave of relief crashed over her. It was over. The nightmare was finally over. She could go back to her quiet, ordinary life, back to being an invisible server, pouring wine for arrogant billionaires who never even learned her name. But as she looked at him standing there, bathed in firelight, something terrifying dawned on her. The thought of walking out that door and never seeing him again felt strangely, achingly hollow. She stood, letting the blanket slip from her shoulders, and picked up the envelope. "Thank you," she said softly. She turned to walk toward the door, her heart aching with a bizarre, confusing sorrow she didn't fully understand. But before she could take 3 steps, he moved. In a blur, he was standing right in front of her, blocking her path, his dark eyes burning with an intense, consuming fire. "I said you were free to go," he murmured, his voice dropping to a rough, hypnotic whisper as he stepped closer. "But I never said I would let you walk away." Her breath caught in her throat. "We had a deal." "I'm a selfish, ruthless man, Josephine," he confessed, reaching out to gently trace the curve of her cheek. "I built an empire on blood and fear, but tonight I found something worth more than territory, more than weapons, more than all of it. I found a woman who can stand beside me in the darkest possible storm and not break. You're brilliant, you're fierce, and you're beautiful. I can't send you back to a life that doesn't deserve you." He leaned down until his lips hovered just a fraction of an inch from hers. "Stay with me. Rule this city with me. Let me give you everything you've ever been denied." Josie looked up into the eyes of the most dangerous man in the city. A man who had insulted her, threatened her, blackmailed her, and then thrown his own body between her and a hail of bullets. The sensible part of her brain was screaming at her to run, to get out while she still could. But the other part of her, the fierce, untamed part, the same part that had looked a crime boss dead in the eye and called him a coward in his own secret language, leaned forward. She closed the distance between them and kissed him. Fierce, desperate. A kiss that sealed her fate completely. The invisible waitress was gone for good. And in her place stood someone new entirely. Someone powerful. Someone who would never again be underestimated by anyone. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think she made the right choice? Was this love, or was it just another trap dressed up in firelight and pretty words? Because a man who blackmails you into danger isn't exactly a fairy tale prince, no matter how good he looks in a tailored shirt. But then again, he did take a bullet's worth of risk to keep her alive. So what's really going on here, and where does a story like this even go next? If this one had you holding your breath, if you felt that tension in the warehouse and that spark in the penthouse, then do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps more than you know. Share this story with someone who loves a good dangerous romance, the kind that keeps you guessing right up until the final word. And if you want more stories exactly like this one, full of twists, drama, and characters who refuse to stay quiet, make sure you subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. And drop a comment down below. Tell me, what do you think he does next? Does he let her rule beside him, or does the darkness of his world swallow them both? I read every single one, and I just might build the next story around your idea. So don't be shy. Let's hear it.